When my father passed away, my family gathered in a Seattle law office, eagerly waiting for their payouts. They cheered loudly when my golden child brother inherited a $3 million Miami mansion, leaving me with nothing but an off-grid cabin in the Alaskan wilderness. My own fiancé took one look at my inheritance, called me a pathetic loser, and walked out on me. I had lost my father, my family, and my husband in a matter of minutes. But what none of those people realized was that the wasteland they tossed me like garbage was sitting on a secret worth $800 million. I am Cassidy, 33 years old, and I am an environmental data analyst. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been underestimated by people who were supposed to love you. The walls of the Seattle law firm felt like a pressure cooker. The attorney, Mr. Montgomery, cleared his throat and closed the folder. He had just finished reading my father's last will and testament. My mother, Sylvia, did not even attempt to hide her delight. She clapped her hands together, the diamonds on her fingers catching the fluorescent light. Bradley, my older brother, let out a triumphant cheer. He had just been handed the keys, the deed, and full ownership of a sprawling, sun-drenched waterfront estate in Miami. Then Mr. Montgomery slid a thin, worn manila envelope across the polished table toward me. I opened it, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. Inside was a crumpled deed to an abandoned off-grid cabin in the most remote part of the Alaskan wilderness. No cash accounts, no stock portfolios, just a rotting wooden structure located thousands of miles away from modern civilization. Before I could process what I was looking at, Simone snatched the paper right out of my hands. Simone was Bradley's wife, a fiercely ambitious African-American real estate agent from Miami, who never missed an opportunity to remind me of her expensive designer wardrobe and massive six-figure commissions. She held the fragile deed up to the light and let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut straight through the quiet boardroom. "A rotting shack in the snow?" Simone sneered, tossing the paper back onto the table with utter disdain. "I guess your dad finally realized an environmental data analyst is just a glorified tree hugger. That frozen cabin is the perfect place for you to go count pine cones while Bradley runs a real business down in Florida." I felt my face burn with intense humiliation, but I forced myself to keep my posture perfectly straight. Bradley and Simone had never worked a hard day in their lives. Bradley ran a flashy cryptocurrency fund that was constantly teetering on the edge of disaster, always bailed out by my parents' endless bank accounts. Meanwhile, I had spent the last decade quietly building my career, analyzing complex soil samples, studying geological data, and paying my own way through life. Yet in my toxic family's eyes, I was the ultimate failure, simply because I did not chase shallow wealth. I turned to look at Derek, my fiancé of 2 years, expecting him to put a comforting hand on my shoulder or defend me against Simone's cruel remarks. Instead, Derek was staring at the Alaskan deed with a look of pure disgust. He abruptly stood up from his heavy leather chair. The sudden movement made everyone in the room turn toward him. He walked over to the corner of the room, dropped his half-full coffee cup violently into the trash can, and marched straight back to where I was sitting. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Derek reached for my hand and forcibly slid the engagement ring right off my finger. I sat there completely paralyzed, unable to breathe as he dropped the diamond onto the table next to the worthless Alaskan deed. "I am not spending my 30s married to a pathetic loser who could not even secure her own family's money," Derek said, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "I thought you were getting a piece of the Miami property. You have nothing. We are done, Cassidy." He turned on his heel and walked out of the law office, letting the heavy glass door slam shut behind him. My chest tightened painfully, and the entire room seemed to spin out of control. I had just been publicly discarded by the man I loved, humiliated in front of the very people who were supposed to support me through my grief. I looked at my mother, desperately hoping for a shred of maternal comfort in my darkest moment. Sylvia did not even bat an eyelash at the fact that my engagement had just violently imploded. Instead, she leaned eagerly over the table, entirely focused on my brother's newfound wealth. "Bradley, darling," Sylvia cooed, completely ignoring my silent tears, What color do you think we should paint the pool deck in Miami? I was thinking a lovely Mediterranean white would really make the water pop. They had already erased me from their lives. To them, I was just a nuisance who had finally been dealt with. I slowly reached out and picked up the Alaskan deed, my cold fingers trembling as I folded the heavy paper. As I slid it into my purse, a small, faded yellow sticky note fluttered out from between the pages and landed softly on my lap. I recognized my late father's messy handwriting immediately. I glanced up quickly to make sure no one was watching me. Sylvia Bradley and Simone were far too busy loudly planning their luxurious new life in Florida to pay me any attention. I carefully unfolded the note under the table and read the urgent words my father had secretly left for me. Cassidy, they only see the surface. Look much deeper. Do not sell to Apex. I spent the flight to Anchorage researching Apex Energy. They were a massive corporate conglomerate known for aggressive resource extraction, and they wanted my inherited wasteland badly enough to threaten me. I chartered a rugged truck and drove 6 hours deep into the Alaskan interior. The paved roads quickly deteriorated into a treacherous snow-packed logging trail. The isolation was absolute. There were no gas stations or cell service, just towering pine trees and bone-chilling cold. When I reached the GPS coordinates, the reality of my inheritance set in. The cabin was a weathered wooden box surrendering to the elements. The roof sagged under accumulated snow, and heavy planks covered every window. The front porch groaned in protest as I stepped onto it. The padlock on the front door was rusted shut, but a solid strike from a tire iron shattered the metal. I pushed the door open, bracing myself against the blast of freezing air that rushed out from the dark interior. Inside the cabin was a frozen time capsule. Dust coated a wood-burning stove, a single cot, and an oak table. The temperature inside was somehow colder than the air outside. I set my pelican cases down on the dusty floorboards, my breath forming thick white clouds. I needed to build a fire, unpack my analytical equipment, and figure out exactly why Apex Energy was harassing me over this isolated patch of frozen dirt. Before I could strike a match, the roar of a high-output diesel engine shattered the silence of the forest. I turned toward the open doorway, just as a lifted black truck aggressively breached the tree line. The vehicle tore into the small clearing, its studded tires churning up thick waves of snow and mud before slamming to a halt, inches from my rental vehicle. The maneuver was a classic corporate intimidation tactic. The heavy truck doors swung open and 2 men stepped out into the freezing air. They were built like linebackers, wearing expensive tactical parkas that looked ridiculous against the wilderness. They moved with a predatory swagger, their heavy boots stomping up the wooden steps of my porch without hesitation. They simply barged through the open doorway, bringing a wave of hostility into the small cabin. The lead fixer, a man with a scarred chin and cold gray eyes, tossed a sleek metal briefcase onto my father's oak table. The heavy case hit the wood with a loud thud, popping open to reveal neat stacks of $100 bills. Next to the cash lay a single legal document and a silver pen. "We texted you the offer," the scarred man said, his voice a low rumble. $50,000 cash. Tax-free. All you have to do is sign the deed transfer right now and you can get back on a plane to Seattle. This wilderness is no place for a little city girl playing pioneer. I stared at the cash, my analytical mind racing. $50,000 was a joke. Apex Energy did not send 2 heavily armed fixers into the Alaskan wilderness to hand-deliver petty cash unless the land was worth exponentially more. I crossed my arms over my chest, refusing to break eye contact. "The property is not for sale," I stated firmly, keeping my voice steady. "Take your briefcase and get off my land." The second man, taller and wider than the first, let out a harsh laugh. He stepped forward, invading my personal space, towering over me in an attempt to force submission. He smelled of stale tobacco and cheap cologne. "You do not seem to understand the situation, sweetheart," the taller man sneered, reaching out to tap the contract with a thick finger. "Apex Energy always gets what it wants. You can walk away today with 50 grand, or you can stay here and freeze to death when accidents start happening to this rotting shack. We can make your life very difficult. Sign the paper." They thought I was weak. They thought because I was a woman alone in the woods I would crumble under pressure. They had clearly never dealt with someone who had survived Sylvia and Simone. I did not flinch. I did not step back. Instead, my eyes darted to the far wall of the cabin directly behind the two men. Mounted on a pair of wooden pegs was my father's vintage hunting rifle. In one fluid, practiced motion, I sidestepped the taller man, reached across the room, and pulled the heavy rifle down from the wall. The men froze, their arrogant smirks vanishing instantly as I expertly worked the bolt action. The sharp mechanical clack of a round entering the chamber echoed like a thunderclap. I did not aim the weapon at them. Instead, I leveled the barrel squarely at the pristine engine block of their black truck parked outside. "You have exactly 3 seconds to take your money and get off my property," I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "before I start doing some very expensive property damage to your corporate vehicle." It is a long walk back to Anchorage. The scarred man raised his hands defensively, his face draining of color. He quickly snapped the briefcase shut, grabbing the contract and the silver pen. They stumbled backward out the door, tripping over each other in their haste to reach the truck. "You are making a massive mistake, you crazy freak," the taller man yelled as he scrambled into the passenger seat. "Apex will bury you in legal fees. You will not see a dime." The diesel engine roared to life, and the truck aggressively reversed out of the yard, fishtailing wildly before disappearing back down the logging trail. I stood on the porch with the rifle lowered, watching until the sound of their engine faded entirely into the wind. My heart was racing, my hands shaking slightly from the confrontation, but a fierce sense of satisfaction bloomed in my chest. I had successfully defended my ground. I returned inside, securing the door behind me, and leaned the rifle back against the wall. The adrenaline was slowly leaving my system, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling cold. I needed to get the fire started immediately. I walked toward the wood stove, my heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. Suddenly, I felt a strange shift beneath my right foot. One of the thick wooden planks near the center of the room was noticeably uneven, giving way slightly under my weight. I knelt down, running my gloved fingers along the edge of the board. The nails holding it in place had been deliberately removed. I pried the heavy plank upward, setting it aside. Hidden beneath the floor was a rusted metal lockbox. I pulled it out, my fingers clumsy with the cold, and popped the unsecured latch. Inside the box lay a collection of incredibly detailed, hand-drawn geological maps. My father had marked specific quadrants with complex chemical formulas. I spread the largest map out on the oak table. Right in the center of the topography, hovering over the exact coordinates of this region, my father had drawn a massive red circle. Written boldly inside the red ink were 2 simple words: the future. I stared at the thick red circle my father had drawn on the geological map. The future. The words pulsed with an urgency that cut straight through the freezing Alaskan air. I did not have time to sit and wonder. I needed data. I grabbed the heavy pelican cases I had dragged into the cabin and began snapping the reinforced latches open. This was my domain. Bradley could have his cryptocurrency, and Sylvia could have her real estate flips. I had hard science. I carefully assembled my portable spectrometer on the dusty oak table, hooking the primary power supply up to a high-capacity lithium battery pack. The machine hummed to life, its digital screen casting a sharp blue glow across the dark freezing room. My fingers were stiff and numb from the cold, but I worked with practiced precision. Inside the rusted metal lockbox, tucked beneath the geological maps, were several dozen cylindrical glass vials containing core soil samples. My father had clearly gathered these specimens during his last unannounced trip to the state. I picked up the first vial. The soil was a dense, dark gray clay, mixed with streaks of rust-colored sediment. I prepared a tiny fraction of the dirt, mixing it with a specialized chemical reagent solution in a sterile testing cuvette. I slid the sample into the spectrometer processing chamber and hit execute. The machine whirred quietly, processing the chemical breakdown of the soil. I pulled my thick designer trench coat tighter around my shoulders, watching the digital progress bar slowly fill across the screen. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing alarm shattered the quiet cabin. The spectrometer screen flashed a bright crimson red. Critical error, sensor overload, calibration exceeded. I frowned, tapping the screen to clear the warning. Spectrometers were highly sensitive instruments. I assumed the freezing temperatures inside the uninsulated cabin were throwing off the internal calibration matrix. I quickly ran a standard diagnostic protocol, resetting the baseline metrics, and loaded a second sample vial into the testing chamber. 2 minutes later, the exact same piercing alarm echoed off the wooden walls. The machine was rejecting the data outright. The readings were spiking so high that the software assumed the hardware was malfunctioning. My analytical mind kicked into overdrive. I opened the manual override interface and bypassed the automated safety limits. I commanded the machine to process the raw, unfiltered data, regardless of the threshold parameters. I watched intently as the spectrometer engaged again. The graph on the screen spiked violently, shooting past every established benchmark I had ever seen in my decade of environmental data analysis. It was not a hardware malfunction. It was not a software error. The concentration of elemental isotopes in the soil was simply astronomical. I leaned closer to the glowing screen, my breath catching in my throat as the final chemical breakdown materialized. The data was undeniable. The soil samples were saturated with heavy, rare earth elements. Specifically, the readings showed massive concentrations of neodymium and dysprosium. To the average person, those names meant absolutely nothing. To an environmental analyst, they were the holy grail of modern industry. These specific elements were the critical, irreplaceable components required to manufacture high-performance permanent magnets. They were the essential building blocks for electric vehicle motors, wind turbine generators, and advanced military guidance systems. The global supply chain was currently choking on a massive deficit of these exact materials. I noted the distinct molecular compositions flashing across the readouts, confirming formulas like ND2Fe14B potential. I quickly pulled up a satellite geological modeling program on my laptop offline, but loaded with pre-downloaded regional data. I input the concentration levels from the spectrometer and cross-referenced them with my father's hand-drawn maps. The software processed the geological modeling, mapping out the subterranean veins based on the sample density. The estimated volume of the deposit was staggering. Based on current market valuations, the untapped vein sitting beneath this frozen Alaskan soil was worth approximately $800 million. Apex Energy was not trying to buy a rotting cabin for $50,000. They were trying to steal a billion-dollar fortune for absolute pennies. My father had stumbled upon the largest untapped rare earth deposit in North America, and he had hidden the coordinates here for me to find. He knew I was the only person in the family with the scientific expertise to actually understand what I was looking at. Bradley would have sold the land for a quick payout without a second thought. A triumphant laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the empty cabin. I was holding the key to an empire. I grabbed my father's map, tracing the thick red circle with my finger. I needed to verify the exact property lines. I booted up my handheld GPS tracker, waiting impatiently for the satellite uplink to establish a connection through the thick pine canopy above the cabin. The device chimed softly, locking onto my coordinates. I mapped my current position directly against the geological rendering on my laptop screen. The digital overlay merged with the subterranean vein mapping. My triumphant smile vanished instantly. A cold, heavy dread dropped into the pit of my stomach. I zoomed in on the screen, verifying the data 3 separate times. The massive $800 million vein of neodymium and dysprosium was not located beneath my cabin. It was not on my property at all. According to the precise GPS rendering, my father's inherited land ended exactly 50 yards behind the back porch. The cabin itself was sitting directly on top of a highly toxic abandoned 1970s mining runoff site. The soil immediately beneath my boots was worthless poisoned dirt. The massive rare earth deposit, the fortune that Apex Energy was so desperate to secure, was located entirely beneath the neighboring 500 acres of dense forest. And according to the Federal Land Registry database blinking brightly on my screen, those 500 acres were completely and strictly protected, unclaimable public land. The laptop screen cast sharp shadows across the dusty floorboards as the reality of the situation locked into place. My father had found the mother lode, but he had run out of time. He died before he could actually purchase the rights to the adjacent 500 acres. Apex Energy clearly had their own geological surveys, but their data was slightly flawed. They assumed the epicenter of the rare earth deposit was situated directly beneath my inherited cabin, or they absolutely needed my specific parcel of land to access the adjoining wilderness safely. Before I could process the gravity of this revelation, the satellite phone in my emergency kit began to ring. The shrill electronic tone cut through the freezing air. I stared at the flashing screen for exactly 3 seconds before pressing the answer button and lifting the device to my ear. Miss Cassidy, a smooth, heavily polished voice purred through the static. My name is Marcus Vance. I am a senior acquisitions director for Apex Energy. I understand my associates paid you a visit earlier today. I apologize if their methods were a bit unrefined. We prefer to handle these matters amicably. I kept my breathing steady and remained perfectly silent, letting him fill the dead air. We want your land. Marcus continued, the false warmth dropping from his tone entirely. We are prepared to offer you $5 million. That is a life-changing sum for a girl in your position. But let me be perfectly clear. If you refuse, we have deep pockets and excellent lawyers. We will utilize eminent domain loopholes, cite environmental hazards from the old mining runoff, and seize your property through federal litigation. You will spend the next decade in court and walk away with absolutely nothing. Take the $5 million. My mind worked at lightning speed. Marcus Vance was confirming everything. Apex Energy was blind to the exact location of the rare earth vein. They were aggressive because they thought I was sitting right on top of their prize. If I told them to go to hell, they would tie up my land in court and eventually survey the surrounding area. I needed them completely distracted while I secured the real asset. I cannot make this kind of decision right now, I said, forcing my voice to tremble slightly, playing the part of a terrified, overwhelmed woman. My father just died. My fiancé left me. I am sitting in a freezing cabin and your men scared me to death. I need a few days to think about it and talk to a lawyer. I could practically hear Marcus smiling on the other end of the line. He thought he had broken me. Of course, Miss Cassidy, Marcus said smoothly. Take 48 hours. Review the documents my men left behind. We will expect your signature by Monday morning. The line went dead. I dropped the phone onto the oak table and immediately turned back to my laptop. The terrified victim routine evaporated instantly. I had exactly 48 hours to steal an $800 million empire right out from under a corporate behemoth. I bypassed the standard internet browsers and logged directly into the Alaska Department of Natural Resources' secure land auction portal. The state frequently auctioned off remote, undeveloped parcels of public land to generate revenue. I typed in the exact GPS coordinates of the 500 acres located directly behind my cabin. The parcel loaded on the screen. It was currently listed as active and available for immediate commercial purchase. The asking price was exactly $65,000. I opened a new tab and accessed my primary banking dashboard. I had $30,000 in my personal savings account accumulated through years of living frugally and working overtime while my brother squandered his allowance on luxury cars. It was not enough. I navigated to my retirement portfolio. Without a single second of hesitation, I initiated an emergency liquidation of my entire 401k. The early withdrawal penalties would be brutal, but I did not care. The funds transferred into my checking account, bringing the total to $58,000. I was still exactly $7,000 short. I pulled my wallet from my designer trench coat and lined up my 3 credit cards on the table. I processed maximum cash advances on all 3, draining my available credit to 0. The combined funds pushed my balance to exactly $66,000. I had liquidated every single asset I owned to my name. If my geological analysis was wrong, I was completely bankrupt and stranded in the Alaskan wilderness. But I trusted my science, and I trusted my father. I returned to the land auction portal. I could not purchase the property under my own name. Apex Energy would monitor public registries. I quickly registered a dummy limited liability corporation online, naming it Pinecone Holdings as a silent tribute to Simone's cruel joke at the law firm. I linked my completely drained bank account to the portal and clicked purchase. The screen displayed a spinning loading wheel. The seconds dragged on like hours. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I watched the digital progress bar. Then the screen flashed a brilliant green. Transaction approved. Deed of sale issued to Pinecone Holdings, LLC. I slammed my hands down on the oak table and let out a triumphant shout that rattled the frosted windows. I had done it. I officially owned the rights to an $800 million rare earth mineral deposit. Apex Energy could have my toxic cabin. I owned the future. As I sat back in the dusty wooden chair to catch my breath, my cell phone buzzed sharply against the table. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed Simone's name. I frowned. Why would my venomous sister-in-law be calling me? I pressed the answer button and lifted the phone to my ear, but before I could speak, a chaotic wall of sound assaulted my eardrum. Simone was not calling to gloat. She had accidentally pocket-dialed me. Through the muffled static of the connection, I could hear Simone screaming hysterically. Her usually composed voice was fractured and shrill, echoing wildly in what sounded like a large empty room. "What do you mean the Miami house is being foreclosed?" Simone shrieked, the raw panic in her tone unmistakable. "Bradley, you looked me in the eye and said it was completely paid off. Where did the money go?" The connection on my phone remained wide open, transmitting every echo of the disaster unfolding 3,000 miles away. I pressed the speaker tight against my ear, listening as the illusion of the perfect family shattered into pieces. In the sprawling foyer of the Miami mansion, the polished marble floors were no longer a symbol of wealth. They were the staging ground for a financial massacre. Bradley was pacing frantically near the glass staircase, his perfect hair disheveled, sweat staining his silk shirt. Simone had thrown her phone onto a velvet sofa in a blind rage, completely unaware the device was broadcasting their collapse directly to my Alaskan cabin. "Bradley, you lied to me!" Simone's voice pierced the cavernous room, sharp and hysterical. "You told me the crypto fund was just experiencing a temporary market correction. You said we were liquid. We were liquid," Bradley shouted back, his voice cracking with a pathetic edge. "The algorithms failed. The exchange froze my accounts and margin calls wiped out the portfolio. I have zero capital, Simone. It is all gone." "And the house," Simone shrieked, hurling a throw pillow across the room. She pointed a trembling finger toward the massive front doors, where a formal foreclosure notice was taped directly over the custom frosted glass. "You said your father left us this property free and clear. I am a luxury real estate agent, Bradley. I know what a default looks like." Bradley backed away, cornered like a frightened animal. "I did not know about the lien, Simone. I swear. Dad took out a secret $2.5 million loan against the deed 3 years ago to cover his offshore debts. The lawyers hid it in a secondary trust. The bank has been sending warning notices for months, but I threw them away because I thought the crypto surge would let me pay it off quietly." "You threw the notices away," Simone repeated, her tone dropping to a dangerous, venomous whisper. "You thought a digital coin with a dog on it was going to pay off a multi-million-dollar bank lien, you absolute fraud." Heavy footsteps echoed as Simone stormed up the grand staircase and reappeared moments later dragging 3 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases. She began furiously stuffing her designer wardrobe, rare handbags, and diamond jewelry into the expensive luggage. She did not care about folding anything. She was looting a sinking ship. Bradley rushed forward, grabbing her arm in a pathetic attempt to stop her, but she violently shoved him backward. "Do not touch me, you broke, pathetic loser," Simone snarled, zipping her largest suitcase with violent force. "I married a visionary investor with a trust fund, not a bankrupt idiot who cannot even read a property deed. I am going back to my condo in South Beach, and I am calling my divorce attorney the second I get there. Do not ever contact me again." Simone dragged her luggage out the back patio doors, the wheels clacking loudly against the imported Italian tile. She did not even bother to look back at the man she had just completely emasculated. The sound of her Mercedes starting and speeding away down the driveway echoed through the open phone line. Bradley collapsed onto the velvet sofa, burying his face in his trembling hands. From the corner of the room, a low, agonizing wail rose into the air. Sylvia, my mother, who had always carried herself with the untouchable grace of a billionaire matriarch, was sitting completely crumpled on the cold marble floor. Her expensive pearls hung crookedly around her neck, and her perfect makeup was heavily streaked with mascara and tears. She was hyperventilating, staring blankly at the foreclosure notice taped to the front door. "Bradley, tell me this is a mistake," Sylvia begged, her voice frail and completely stripped of its usual arrogance. "The country club fees are due tomorrow. The yacht club memberships are pending renewal. Where are we going to live when the bank locks the doors? I cannot be seen in a middle-class neighborhood. I will be ruined in Boston society." Bradley did not answer her. He was hyperventilating, too completely paralyzed by the reality of his own catastrophic incompetence. The golden child, the financial genius who had always mocked my steady analytical career, had managed to lose his entire inheritance, his marriage, and his mother's future in a matter of days. He reached blindly for the phone Simone had abandoned on the sofa, desperate to find a number for an emergency lender, a bailout, a miracle. As Bradley unlocked the screen, I heard the distinctive chime of a news alert cutting through the heavy, depressing silence of the Miami mansion. Bradley stopped breathing. The silence stretched on for 5 agonizing seconds. "Mom," Bradley whispered, his voice suddenly sharp and breathless. "Mom, look at this. What is it?" Sylvia sobbed, her voice muffled against the marble floor. "Are they giving us more time?" Bradley ignored her tears. I could hear him frantically tapping the screen, his breathing accelerating rapidly. "It is an alert from the Wall Street Journal," he said, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic rush. "Market rumors. A massive untapped vein of neodymium and dysprosium was just detected in the Alaskan interior. Rare earth elements. The Geological Survey estimates the strike is worth $800 million. Sylvia sniffled, clearly uncomprehending. "What does that have to do with our foreclosure, Bradley? We need cash, not rocks." "It has everything to do with us," Bradley shouted suddenly, jumping up from the sofa. His voice was frantic, trembling with a sudden greedy desperation. "The coordinates in the article, Mom. The strike is located right underneath that worthless cabin Dad left to Cassidy. The little tree hugger is sitting on $1 billion. We have to call her right now and force her to sell the property to us before she figures out what she actually has. We can still save absolutely everything now." The stove radiated comforting heat through the small wooden room, pushing back the bitter Alaskan cold. I stood at the counter, stirring a pot of stew, listening to the broth. The crushing weight of my family's expectations had vanished. I was the sole owner of Pinecone Holdings. The ground beneath my 500 acres held a subterranean fortune that defied comprehension. I took a deep breath, savoring the sweet victory. That hard-earned peace shattered 10 minutes later. My satellite phone erupted with notifications. The screen lit up, vibrating violently. It was an organized assault. 10 missed calls, 15 text messages, voicemails stacking up one after another. I picked up the device. The caller ID flashed wildly. Sylvia. The Wall Street Journal article had clearly made its rounds through the Boston country clubs and Miami real estate circles. Bradley had figured it out. I pressed the accept button and lifted the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. "Cassidy, my beautiful girl." Sylvia's voice burst through the speaker, dripping with a sickening fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Oh, sweetheart, we have missed you so much. I was just telling Bradley how empty the house feels without you." I leaned against the dusty counter, crossing my arms. "You spoke to me 3 days ago, Sylvia. You told me my presence was a suffocating embarrassment." Sylvia let out a high-pitched laugh. "Oh, darling, you know how emotional grief makes us. We said silly things. But family is family, Cassidy. We belong together. In fact, your brother's going through a tough time right now. A little financial hiccup. He needs his sister. We were thinking we should all fly up to Alaska. We can have a beautiful family reunion in your charming little cabin. We can help you manage things." Manage things. That was her code word for seizing control. She wanted to manipulate me into signing away my rights and use my rare earth deposit to pay off Bradley's debts. They thought I was completely oblivious to the wealth beneath my feet. "Sorry, Sylvia," I said, my voice dropping to a flat, authoritative pitch. "My cabin is strictly reserved for pathetic losers. I would not want you to ruin your designer shoes in the mud." "Cassidy, please, you do not understand," Sylvia pleaded, her fake warmth cracking, revealing the desperate panic underneath. "The Miami property is gone. Bradley made a mistake. We need to come up there and look at the land. We need to work together to sell it. We are your family." "You are a financial liability," I replied smoothly. "For the record, the land beneath this cabin is a toxic mining dump. The real fortune is safely secured under an LLC you will never touch. Enjoy foreclosure." I ended the call before she could scream another word. I immediately blocked her number. I blocked Bradley. I blocked every single contact associated with my father's former estate. The heavy silence that followed was absolute perfection. I returned to my stew, a fierce, undeniable energy coursing through my veins. They had built their entire identities on a fragile illusion of wealth, and now they were suffocating under the brutal reality of their own greed. The next 48 hours were blissfully productive. I finalized the topographical maps securing the exact borders of Pinecone Holdings. I established a secure communication channel with an environmental attorney in Seattle outlining my terms for independent excavation. Apex Energy tried to call twice more, but their tone was increasingly erratic. They knew someone had bought the adjacent parcel, but the dummy corporation shielded my identity. I was holding all the cards now. 2 days later, a brutal winter storm rolled into the valley. The wind howled through the towering pines, throwing heavy sheets of white snow against the reinforced cabin windows. I was sitting by the stove reviewing core samples when a sudden violent pounding rattled the heavy solid wooden front door. Apex Energy had promised they would return, but driving up the treacherous logging road in a blinding snowstorm was practically suicidal. I stood up, walked deliberately to the far wall, and pulled my father's vintage hunting rifle down from its wooden pegs. I checked the chamber, ensuring a round was loaded, and slung the heavy strap over my shoulder. The pounding resumed, frantic and sharp. I grabbed the iron handle, unlatched the deadbolt, and pulled the heavy door open against the howling wind. Standing on my porch, shivering violently beneath the icy Alaskan gusts, was Simone. She looked entirely out of place. She was wrapped in a ridiculous floor-length white mink coat that was rapidly collecting snow. Her expensive designer boots were caked in freezing mud, and her styled hair was whipped across her face by the storm. She was a Miami real estate queen drowning in an Arctic nightmare. Flanking her was a man I did not recognize. He wore a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit, completely inadequate for the weather, covered by a thin cashmere overcoat. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and possessed the distinct predatory posture of a sleazy corporate litigator. He looked at me with cold, assessing eyes. "Cassidy!" Simone gasped, her voice trembling from the freezing temperature. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, hugging the ridiculous fur coat closer to her body. After screaming at Bradley and abandoning him in Miami, she had somehow managed to charter a flight and navigate the wilderness just to find me. The scent of her expensive perfume warred with the pine trees. I stood squarely in the doorway, blocking their entry. I kept my hand resting near the strap of the rifle, making sure the weapon was highly visible. I did not step aside. I did not offer them shelter. "We need to talk, sister-in-law," Simone demanded, her teeth clicking together. She shot a desperate glance at the warm fire burning inside my cabin. "It is about the land. We have a proposition." Simone definitely did not wait for an invitation. She pushed her way past me, her heavy mink coat brushing against my heavy canvas jacket, bringing a blast of freezing wind and the overwhelming scent of Chanel into my father's rugged sanctuary. The contrast between her manufactured glamour and the harsh reality of the Alaskan wilderness was almost comical. The corporate lawyer followed closely on her heels, snapping his briefcase shut to protect it from the swirling snow before I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, cutting off the howling gale. Simone stood in the center of the room, shivering violently, her eyes darting around the rustic interior with undisguised disgust. She took in the cast-iron stove, the dusty oak table, and the rudimentary testing equipment I had left out. She curled her lip deliberately, stepping away from a small pile of chopped firewood, as if it might infect her. She looked at me as if I were a stray dog that had somehow wandered into a luxury boutique. "This place is an absolute nightmare," Simone sneered, rubbing her arms clad in expensive snow-dampened fur. "I cannot believe you are actually living in this squalor, Cassidy. But then again, you always did lack a certain refined taste. I am here because Bradley is currently dealing with a massive migraine back in Boston, trying to salvage the disaster your father left behind." I kept my hand near the rifle slung over my shoulder. "You flew 3,000 miles in a blizzard to insult my interior decorating, Simone. You could have just sent an email. Do not play cute with me," she snapped, stepping closer to the wood-burning stove to thaw her frozen hands. "The Miami house is gone. The bank locked the doors yesterday. Bradley's crypto fund was a total illusion, and now we are facing absolute financial ruin. But Bradley saw the Wall Street Journal alert. We know exactly what is buried under this worthless patch of dirt. Rare earth minerals, $1 billion payout." Simone gestured to the lawyer, who stepped forward with a practiced, predatory smile. He unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, dropping them onto the oak table with a heavy thud. "My name is Arthur Sterling," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and dripping with condescension. "I represent your brother. We have drafted a highly generous agreement to resolve this unfortunate family dispute. Bradley is willing to allow you to keep 20% of the mineral extraction rights. The remaining 80% will be transferred immediately to his control, allowing him to save the family's financial standing." I stared at the thick stack of papers, letting a harsh, humorless laugh escape my lips. 80%. You want me to hand over the rights to my land so Bradley can pay off his bad margin calls and keep you in designer handbags. Arthur Sterling adjusted his expensive silk tie. "If you refuse to sign, Miss Wilson, I am prepared to file a comprehensive lawsuit tomorrow morning. We will claim that you manipulated a mentally declining old man into changing his estate. We will tie this property up in federal probate court for the next decade. By the time the legal fees drain your meager savings, you will be begging us to take it for free. Sign the papers, Cassidy." Simone crossed her arms, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. "Save the family, Cassidy. For once in your life, do something useful instead of being a stubborn, selfish disappointment." They really thought I was the same quiet, compliant girl who used to shrink away from their insults at Thanksgiving dinners. They thought I would crumble under the threat of a lawsuit. They had no idea who they were standing in front of. I stepped away from the door and walked slowly toward the oak table. I did not look at the papers. I looked directly into Arthur Sterling's cold gray eyes. "You are a terrible lawyer, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. "First of all, Alaska statute title 13 Section 16 explicitly requires clear and convincing medical evidence of diminished capacity at the exact time the will was executed. My father passed a full psychiatric evaluation the week before he signed the deed transfer administered by a board-certified neurologist in Boston. I have the notarized medical records in a secure vault." Arthur's confident smirk faltered slightly. He blinked clearly, not expecting a detailed legal rebuttal from a woman standing in a freezing cabin. "Secondly," I continued, leaning closer to him, "you cannot file a probate dispute on a property that is no longer legally part of the estate. The deed was transferred to me while he was alive, making it a completed inter vivos gift. Your lawsuit would be thrown out of court with prejudice before the clerk even finishes stamping the file." I turned my attention to Simone. The triumphant look had vanished from her face, replaced by a pale, twitchy anxiety. "But here's the most important part," I said, tapping the heavy wooden stock of the vintage hunting rifle slung over my shoulder. "Under Alaska's highly robust property defense laws, you are currently trespassing on private land. I asked you to leave. You barged in. I have a loaded .30-06 rifle and the state troopers are a 6-hour drive away." Simone took a rapid step backward, her expensive boots slipping slightly on the dusty floorboards. "You would not dare," she gasped, her eyes locked on the weapon. "I have spent the last decade watching you and Bradley strip this family down to the bone." I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am not giving you a single dime. Get out of my cabin." Arthur scrambled to grab his briefcase, abandoning the thick stack of unsigned legal documents on the table. He did not say another word as he practically ran for the heavy wooden door. Simone followed him, her face twisted with a mixture of terror and absolute fury. I opened the door, letting the brutal, freezing wind howl back into the room. They stumbled out onto the snow-covered porch. Their chartered, tracked vehicle was idling at the tree line, barely visible through the blinding whiteout conditions. I stood in the doorway, the rifle held across my chest, watching them shiver violently as the Arctic cold bit through their expensive city clothes. Simone stopped at the bottom of the porch stairs. The snow was already reaching her knees, ruining her designer boots. She turned back to look at me, her face pale and contorted with an ugly, venomous rage. The wind whipped her hair wildly around her face. "You think you won?" Simone snarled, screaming to be heard over the roaring blizzard. "You think you can keep this fortune for yourself, while we lose everything? Bradley is filing an injunction tomorrow morning. We found a loophole in the original family trust. That cabin is ours. Cassidy, we are taking it all." I did not even bother to respond. I slammed the heavy wooden door shut, sliding the deadbolt into place with a metallic crack. The storm raged for 2 days, bearing the tire tracks of Simone's retreat under 3 feet of powder. I spent that time barricaded inside, mapping out the geological boundaries of my claim and solidifying my defense strategy. I assumed Simone's threat was another hysterical outburst, the desperate flailing of a woman accustomed to getting her way. I underestimated the panicked determination of a man facing total financial annihilation. On Tuesday morning, the snowplows finally cleared the logging road, allowing a courier truck to reach my property line. The driver trudged up to my porch, his face obscured by a thick scarf, and handed me a manila envelope sealed with red tape. He did not ask for a signature. He dropped it into my hands, muttered an apology, and hurried back to his idling vehicle. I tore open the heavy envelope right there in the freezing air. It contained a massive stack of official court summons filed in the Massachusetts Federal District Court, alongside a temporary restraining order issued by a judge with a reputation for favoring old Boston money. Bradley had actually done it. He had scraped together the last remnants of his credit to hire Sterling Vance and Hughes, a ruthless litigation firm known for bleeding defendants dry through procedural delays. According to the injunction, Bradley was claiming that my father had transferred the Alaskan deed while under severe mental duress, and that the property technically belonged to an undivided family trust. It was a fabricated legal fiction, a desperate Hail Mary designed to stall my extraction plans until I ran out of money to fight them. I walked back inside, my mind racing as I scanned the dense legalese. They requested an immediate freeze on all operations, citing potential environmental damage and the preservation of contested assets. The real blow landed when I logged into my laptop to check my finances. A red notification banner flashed across the top of my primary banking portal. My accounts were temporarily suspended. Bradley's legal team filed an ex parte motion freezing my liquid assets to prevent me from retaining top legal counsel. They wanted to isolate me in the wilderness, cut off my resources, and starve me into submission. It was a classic corporate siege tactic executed with brutal precision. I had $1 billion sitting beneath my boots, but I could not buy a tank of gas. As if frozen accounts were not enough, my phone chimed with a breaking news alert from a mining aggregate site. Apex Energy had officially entered the fray. Their press release publicly backed Bradley's legal claim to the Pinecone Holdings estate. They cited an unverified preliminary agreement with Bradley promising rapid economic development for the region once rightful ownership was restored. It was incredibly transparent. Apex knew Bradley was drowning in debt. They were funding his aggressive legal assault in exchange for a severely discounted purchase price the second he seized the deed. They smelled blood in the water and were circling like sharks, expecting the isolated sister to surrender under the combined weight of a corporate conglomerate and a vicious legal freeze. I packed the stack of court documents into my leather satchel, grabbed my keys, and headed down the mountain toward the nearest town. I needed reliable internet access to counterfile the injunction, and my satellite connection was too slow to handle encrypted legal portals. The drive was treacherous, the roads slick with black ice, but the physical focus kept my rising anger in check. I parked outside a neon-lit diner on the edge of town, a place with peeling vinyl booths and endless refills of terrible coffee. The bell above the door chimed as I walked in, seeking the warmth of the back corner booth. I spread the injunction papers across the sticky Formica table, connecting my laptop to the unsecured network. I began systematically dismantling their arguments, pulling up the precise statutes regarding inter vivos gifts and the documented psychiatric evaluations my father had completed. The waitress dropped a mug of black coffee next to my laptop, giving me a sympathetic nod. I barely noticed her. I was completely absorbed in drafting a motion to dismiss, highlighting the blatant jurisdictional overreach of a Massachusetts court attempting to freeze an Alaskan land deed. I needed to file the countermotion before the court closed for the day on the East Coast. If I could prove the initial freeze was obtained through perjured affidavits regarding my father's mental state, I could unfreeze my accounts and seek immediate punitive damages against his lawyers for filing a frivolous claim. My fingers flew across the keyboard, turning my profound outrage into calculated razor-sharp legal retaliation. I was not the weak link in this family. I was the anvil they were about to break themselves against. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" The voice was jarringly familiar, pulling me violently out of my deep concentration. I froze my hands, hovering over the keyboard. I slowly looked up from my glowing laptop screen. Standing at the edge of my booth wearing a cheap, ill-fitting trench coat and looking completely out of place in the rugged Alaskan diner was Derek, my former fiancé. He looked pathetic. He was shivering, his face pale and drawn, a stark contrast to the perfectly groomed, arrogant man who had humiliated me in front of my entire family just months ago. In his trembling hands, he clutched a wilted bouquet of cheap convenience store flowers, the plastic wrapping crinkling loudly in the quiet diner. He did not wait for an answer. He slid into the booth opposite me, placing the sad flowers directly on top of my legal documents. He offered a weak, practiced smile, his eyes darting around the rustic establishment before settling on my face. "Cassidy, baby," Derek whispered, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I flew all the way out here. I made a huge mistake. Sylvia completely brainwashed me into leaving you. Let us get back together." I stared at the pathetic display in front of me. Derek, the man who had publicly humiliated me at my own engagement party to appease my mother's wealthy country club friends, was sitting in a roadside Alaskan diner. He was clutching a plastic-wrapped bouquet of wilting carnations that smelled faintly of gasoline and cheap air freshener. He looked utterly terrified, shivering violently in his thin, inappropriate trench coat, but his eyes still held that familiar, arrogant gleam. He actually believed his own ridiculous performance. He genuinely thought I was the exact same desperate approval-starved woman he had so easily discarded back in Boston. I kept my expression entirely neutral, my hands resting lightly on the keyboard of my laptop. I did not push the cheap flowers away. I did not scream. I simply watched him sweat under the flickering fluorescent lights of the diner. "Sylvia brainwashed you," I repeated, my voice devoid of any emotional inflection. "That is an absolutely fascinating legal defense, Derek. Tell me, did she use a swinging pendulum, or was it a specialized hypnotherapy technique that forced you to sleep with your junior associate 2 months before our wedding?" Derek flinched, glancing nervously at the waitress who was wiping down the counter across the empty room. He leaned over the sticky Formica table, lowering his voice into a hushed, conspiratorial tone. He reached out, attempting to place his perfectly manicured hand over mine. I pulled my hand back immediately, letting his fingers land awkwardly on the cold plastic of the table. "Cassidy, please, you have to understand the immense pressure I was under," Derek pleaded, widening his eyes to manufacture a look of deep, profound sincerity. "Your family is powerful. Bradley and Sylvia cornered me. They convinced me that you were unstable, that marrying you would ruin my career trajectory at the firm. I was weak. I was a coward. But sitting in Boston watching them launch this vicious legal attack against you, it made me physically sick. I realized I never stopped loving you. I flew all the way out here because I want to protect you. Protect me, I echoed deliberately, letting a tiny hint of vulnerability seep into my voice. I lowered my shoulders slightly, softening my posture to mimic the defeated, exhausted posture he fully expected to see. Beneath the table, completely out of his line of sight, I quietly slipped my right hand into my heavy coat pocket. I grasped my smartphone and pressed the raised side button twice. The familiar double vibration confirmed the hidden audio recording application was active and capturing every single word. Yes, Derek said, his confidence visibly swelling as he interpreted my softened posture as total submission. He puffed out his chest, leaning further across the table. I saw the injunction Bradley filed. It is an absolute bloodbath, Cassidy. Sterling Vance and Hughes will absolutely destroy you in federal court. They are going to freeze your assets, drag you through endless depositions, and completely bankrupt you with legal fees. You are completely out of your depth fighting a Boston litigation firm from a wooden log cabin. I do not have access to my bank accounts, I whispered, playing the part of the helpless victim flawlessly. The bank froze everything this morning. Derek smiled a sickeningly predatory grin that he quickly tried to mask with faux concern. I know. That is exactly why I am here. We can fix this together. If we get married quietly, just a quick courthouse ceremony right here in town, we can establish immediate joint marital assets. I can transfer the title of the Alaskan property into a protected spousal trust. It actively shields the deed from Bradley's probate claims because the property becomes legally entangled in our marital estate. I will handle the lawyers. I will protect the land. You will not have to worry about a single thing. I looked down at the table, hiding the sharp, violent surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. His legal strategy was absolute garbage, a sloppy misinterpretation of marital property laws that would never actually hold up against a federal injunction. But the malicious intent was crystal clear. He wanted his name on the deed. He wanted total control of the billion-dollar neodymium deposit. That sounds incredibly complicated, Derek, I said, keeping my voice soft, almost hesitant. Why would you risk your own lucrative career to fight Bradley for me? Sylvia will destroy your reputation in Boston if you interfere. Derek chuckled, a genuine arrogant sound slipping through his carefully crafted facade. He leaned back against the red vinyl booth, crossing his arms. He thought he had already won. He thought I was begging for his protection. Sylvia's country club influence does not matter anymore, Derek sneered, the mask slipping completely to reveal the greedy opportunist underneath. Bradley is the one holding the leash now, and Bradley is a desperate idiot. Do you really want to know the truth? He called me 3 days ago, sweating bullets about a massive margin call. He knew I still had emotional leverage over you. He promised me a $1 million cut of the initial Apex Energy payout if I could fly up here and trick you into signing the deed over to a joint account before the injunction fully locked you out. He is financing this entire legal strike on borrowed time. He desperately needs the extraction rights secured by Friday, or his creditors are going to seize his Miami penthouse and his cars. The hidden recorder captured every single syllable, the clear admission of conspiracy, the explicit intent to commit fraud, the exact dollar amount of the bribe. I let the heavy silence hang in the air for 5 long seconds, ensuring the audio file registered the ambient noise of the diner, perfectly verifying the location and context. Then I reached into my coat pocket, stopped the recording, and pulled the phone out. I placed it face up on the table right next to his wilted carnations. The bright screen displayed a successfully saved audio file titled Derek Fraud Admission. Derek stared at the screen, his arrogant smile freezing, then slowly melting into an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His panicked eyes darted from the phone to my face, realizing the massive, catastrophic mistake he had just made. Cassidy, he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeak of absolute panic. Cassidy, wait. That was a joke. I did not let him finish his pathetic sentence. I calmly picked up my heavy ceramic mug of black coffee. It was still steaming, scalding hot from the fresh pot the waitress had just poured. Without breaking eye contact, I flicked my wrist and dumped the entire boiling contents of the mug directly into Derek's lap. He shrieked a high, undignified wail of pure agony, violently shoving himself backward against the vinyl booth as the scalding liquid soaked straight through his thin trousers. He scrambled to stand up violently, knocking his knees against the heavy table, gasping and swatting frantically at his burning legs. I stood up, sliding my laptop effortlessly into my leather satchel. I looked down at him as he danced in pain, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the few other patrons in the diner. I am sending this recording directly to the HR department at your new firm, Derek, I said, my voice cutting sharply through his pathetic whimpering. I am also sending a copy to the Massachusetts Bar Association Ethics Committee. Attempting to defraud a property owner through a fabricated marital contract is an immediate disbarment offense. Have fun in the unemployment line, Derek. I turned my back on him and walked confidently toward the exit, the highly satisfying sound of his panicked apologies fading behind me. I pushed open the glass door, stepping out into the freezing Alaskan air. The cold wind felt incredible against my skin. I had just secured the exact leverage I needed to utterly destroy Bradley's legal team. As I reached the handle of my truck, my phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. I glanced at the screen, fully expecting another panicked call from my brother or my mother. Instead, the caller ID displayed an official government seal and a Washington, D.C. area code. I answered the call. Cassidy Wilson, a stern, authoritative voice stated over the line. This is Director Reynolds with the Environmental Protection Agency. We need to discuss the subterranean survey recently filed under Pinecone Holdings. I tightened my grip on the phone, turning away from the frozen diner window. The bustling noise of the waitstaff and clinking coffee mugs faded into the background. I kept my voice perfectly level, revealing absolutely nothing of the sudden spike in my heart rate. This is Cassidy Wilson. I am the sole managing director of Pinecone Holdings. How can I help you, Director Reynolds? Miss Wilson, we received the preliminary core samples your independent surveyors submitted to the State Geological Board yesterday morning. Reynolds said, his tone entirely devoid of pleasantries. The filing triggered an immediate automated federal review. The data indicates a massive subterranean anomaly. I am calling to officially notify you of our findings before the formal paperwork hits your legal address. I leaned forward against the sticky Formica table, my eyes darting to my laptop screen, where my frozen bank accounts were still glaring back at me in red text. I am aware of the anomaly, Director. I commissioned the survey to map the neodymium deposit. You are misunderstanding the situation, Miss Wilson, Reynolds interrupted sharply. We are not calling about the rare earth elements. We cross-referenced your core samples with historical mining data from the 1970s. The specific coordinates holding the original residential cabin, the 2-acre parcel deeded under your personal name, are sitting directly on top of a collapsed, unmapped subterranean retention pond. I stopped breathing. The diner around me went completely silent. A retention pond. A highly concentrated, undocumented chemical dump. Reynolds corrected, his voice echoing with federal authority. 50 years ago, a wildcat mining operation used primitive cyanide and sulfuric acid extraction methods on that ridge. When they went bankrupt, they simply buried the toxic runoff. Your recent core samples confirm that the containment barrier has completely degraded. The soil beneath your cabin is saturated with lethal levels of arsenic, lead, and sulfuric acid. I stared blindly at the wall, processing the sheer magnitude of what he was saying. My father had not left me a quaint, rustic getaway. He had inadvertently deeded me an environmental time bomb. What does this mean for the property? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It means I am officially classifying the exact coordinates of your cabin as a Category 1 Superfund site, effective immediately, Reynolds stated. He did not leave any room for negotiation or argument. He laid out the brutal, uncompromising reality of federal environmental law. Strict and mandatory liability. The current legal owner of the deed is entirely responsible for the cleanup, regardless of who originally caused the contamination. Immediate seizure of operations. Absolutely no commercial extraction, habitation, or development can occur within a 5-mile radius until the site is fully decontaminated. Financial restitution. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates the mandatory chemical excavation and soil replacement will cost a minimum of $40 million. $40 million. A crushing, inescapable federal debt attached directly to the piece of paper currently sitting in my name. My vision tunneled. The freezing wind rattling the diner windows suddenly felt suffocating. But then my analytical mind caught up with the geography. I grabbed my laptop, frantically pulling up the digital topographical maps I had generated 2 days ago. I overlaid the property lines, zooming in on the exact coordinates Reynolds was referencing. "Director Reynolds," I said, my voice suddenly sharp and breathless. "I need you to clarify something immediately. The Superfund classification. Does it cover the adjacent 500 acres? The undeveloped parcel legally registered under the Pinecone Holdings, LLC. I heard the rustle of heavy paper over the line as Reynolds checked his charts. No, that is the fascinating part of this geological formation. The bedrock shifts dramatically just past the eastern property line of the cabin. The toxic saturation is entirely contained within the original 2-acre residential deed. The adjacent 500 acres under your LLC are completely pristine. And the neodymium deposit? I pressed my heart, hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Where exactly does the rare earth vein sit? It sits entirely under the LLC parcel, Miss Wilson, Reynolds confirmed. The deposit stops abruptly at the bedrock fault line right at the border of the contaminated zone. I ended the call, lowering the phone slowly to the table. I stared at the glowing map on my screen. The epiphany hit me with the force of a freight train. Apex Energy was a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate, but they were incredibly lazy. They had relied entirely on satellite imaging, generalized heat maps, and outdated regional fault lines. They saw the massive thermal signature of the billion-dollar neodymium deposit and assumed it was centered directly beneath the only established structure on the ridge. They simply assumed the fortune belonged to the original family deed. Bradley, blinded by his own greed and suffocating under the weight of his catastrophic margin calls, had blindly followed their lead. Neither of them had spent the money to run localized physical core samples. They had absolutely no idea where the actual property lines were drawn, and they had no idea about the toxic waste dump. They thought the cabin was the gold mine. They were utilizing a massive team of aggressive Boston lawyers, spending the absolute last of their borrowed credit and publicly leveraging a multinational energy corporation, all to aggressively steal a $40 million federal debt trap directly out of my hands. A wicked, brilliant smile spread across my face. I started laughing. The sound echoed through the diner, earning me nervous glances from the waitress, but I could not stop. The pure, unadulterated poetry of their corporate negligence was staggering. Bradley was trying to ruin my life, and in doing so, he was fighting tooth and nail to secure his own absolute destruction. The frozen bank accounts were no longer a weapon used against me. They were a blessing. The injunction claiming the property belonged to the family trust was not a threat. It was a perfectly wrapped gift. I opened my contact list and scrolled past the blocked numbers until I found the direct office line for Arthur Sterling Bradley's vicious corporate litigator. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to drop into a hoarse, defeated tremor. I practiced a ragged sigh, summoning the exact sound of a woman who had just been completely broken by the system. The line rang twice before an executive assistant patched me through. "Miss Wilson," Sterling answered, his tone practically vibrating with smug, victorious arrogance. "I assume you have checked your bank balances. Are we finally ready to be reasonable?" "You win," I whispered, injecting a flawless, trembling sob into my performance. I let the silence hang heavily over the line, ensuring he fully absorbed the sound of my total surrender. "I cannot fight you and Apex Energy. I have zero capital left. Tell my brother I surrender. I am completely out of money. I will fly down to Seattle tomorrow morning. I will meet you at your satellite office, and I will sign the cabin's deed entirely over to him." The flight from Alaska to Seattle gave me plenty of time to perfect my performance. I skipped sleeping, skipped brushing my hair, and wore the same rumpled canvas jacket I had been living in for days. I wanted them to see the wilderness on me. I wanted them to smell the campfire smoke and see the exhaustion etched deep into my face. By the time I stepped out of the elevator onto the 42nd floor of the Sterling Vance and Hughes Seattle satellite office, I looked exactly like a woman utterly crushed by the weight of her own family's wealth. The receptionist led me down a long corridor lined with frosted glass and abstract corporate art, her heels clicking sharply against the marble before pushing open the heavy mahogany doors to the main conference room. The atmosphere inside was suffocatingly triumphant. Bradley sat at the head of the massive obsidian table, wearing a bespoke Italian suit that probably cost more than my first car. He was leaning back in his leather chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water, radiating the smug arrogance of a man who believed he had just checkmated his opponent. Simone sat to his right, draped in an immaculate white cashmere blazer, her lips curled into a barely concealed sneer. But it was the woman sitting on Bradley's left that truly completed the picture. My mother, Sylvia. She wore her signature pearls, a Chanel dress, and a look of profound practiced disappointment. Arthur Sterling and a small army of junior associates hovered near the back wall, clutching leather portfolios like vultures waiting for scraps. I stopped just inside the doorway, clutching my worn leather satchel to my chest, letting my shoulders slump forward to project total submission. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on the polished wood floor, avoiding eye contact. "Look who finally decided to join the real world," Bradley said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I must admit, Cassidy, I expected you to hold out a little longer. But then again, you always did fold under pressure. Take a seat. Let us get this over with quickly so we can all go back to our respective lives." I walked slowly to the opposite end of the long table and pulled out a heavy chair, sinking into it with an exaggerated sigh. Sylvia shook her head, letting out a sharp clicking sound with her tongue. "Look at yourself, Cassidy," my mother scolded, her tone laced with that familiar icy judgment. "You look like a vagrant. This is exactly why your father's lapse in judgment regarding that property was so disastrous. You simply lack the refinement and the intellectual capacity to manage significant assets. You are lucky your brother stepped in to fix this mess before you completely ruined the family name. You never belonged in our world." I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. They were so blinded by their own greed and their desperate need to feel superior that they could not see the massive trap I had laid at their feet. "I just want this to stop," I said, forcing my voice to tremble slightly. I looked up at Bradley, widening my eyes to feign pure desperation. "You froze my bank accounts. You sent lawyers to threaten me. You completely isolated me. I cannot fight an entire corporate legal team in Apex Energy. I do not have the resources." Arthur Sterling stepped forward, sliding a thick stack of legal documents across the sleek surface of the table. The papers came to a stop right in front of me. I stared at the bold heading printed at the top, "Full and unconditional transfer of deed and liability." It was a beautiful sight. "These documents constitute a complete surrender of your claims to the 2-acre parcel and the residential structure located upon it," Sterling explained, tapping the paper with a gold pen. "Upon your signature, the temporary restraining order will be lifted, your personal banking assets will be unfrozen, and the family trust will assume total ownership of the specified Alaskan property." I reached out and touched the edge of the contract. "Just the cabin," I murmured, acting as though I was struggling to understand the legal jargon. "And the specific 2 acres it sits on. That is all you want." Bradley rolled his eyes, letting out a harsh, barking laugh. "Of course that is all we want, you idiot. That is where the value is. Sign it, Cassidy. You were never smart enough to play in the big leagues. You tried to steal a fortune that rightfully belongs to this family, and you failed miserably. Take your little frozen bank accounts and go back to being irrelevant." I let my hand hover over the gold pen. I looked at the three of them, perfectly capturing the image of a defeated, broken woman making one last desperate plea for peace. "If I give you the cabin," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "if I sign this right now, you have to promise to drop the lawsuit completely. You have to unfreeze my bank accounts today, and you have to promise to leave me alone forever. You take the property, but you take all the liabilities attached to it. I want to walk away clean." Arthur Sterling nodded briskly. "The contract explicitly states an unconditional release of liability for you regarding that specific parcel. The moment you sign, our firm withdraws all pending litigation against you." I looked over at Simone. She was practically vibrating with excitement, her eyes locked on the gold pen in my hand. She leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the table, unable to contain her malicious glee. "Oh, we will," Simone laughed cruelly. "We will be too busy counting our $800 million to ever think about you again. Sign the paper, loser." I took just one deep breath, savoring the absolute perfection of the moment. With a steady hand, I picked up the pen. The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of pure greed. I stared at the document, the pen feeling like a heavy, cold weight in my hand. My heart was pounding not from the fear they expected, but from the thrill of the final move. Every muscle in my body was coiled tight, ready to spring, but I kept my breathing shallow, my shoulders slumped, and my eyes downcast. I was the picture of a broken woman ready to give up her only leverage for a chance at a quiet, unbothered life. "Bradley," I said, my voice barely audible as I looked up at him through my lashes. "You have to understand, this property has been in our family for decades. I know there are complications with the maintenance and the history of the land. I just need you to be legally bound to protect me from any future fallout once I walk out of here." I paused, feigning a tremor in my hand as I pointed to the bottom of the page. "I want you to add a specific clause before I put my name on this. I need it stated in no uncertain terms that the transferee, that is you, Bradley, assumes all absolute liability, past, present, and future, everything associated with the physical property of that cabin and its exact mapped acreage. I don't want the tax authorities or the state inspectors knocking on my door years from now because you let the place rot. I want a clean break." Arthur Sterling leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he pulled the document toward him, scanning the margins. "A standard indemnification clause, Miss Wilson. It is customary for the buyer to assume liability upon transfer. However, the specificity you are requesting regarding past and present liability is unusual." "She's just a paranoid amateur," Simone interrupted, her patience visibly fraying. She didn't look at the legalities, she looked at the deed. She saw the $800 million in rare earth minerals she was convinced sat under the floorboards of that rotting, drafty cabin. She's worried about a few $1,000s in back property taxes or some minor zoning violation she racked up while playing hermit. Bradley just let her have it. We have bigger things to worry about than her ridiculous anxieties." Bradley smirked, his eyes filled with a dismissive, predatory light. He didn't see a trap. He saw a sister who was so terrified of the big bad world that she was willing to sign away a fortune just to avoid a headache. "Give her the clause, Arthur," Bradley commanded, not taking his eyes off me. "If it makes her feel better to be protected from her own failures, let her have it. I am not worried about a derelict cabin in the middle of nowhere." Sterling hesitated for a fraction of a second, his gaze lingering on the specific language I had dictated, but the pressure from his client was absolute. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his leather briefcase and began typing, his fingers clattering against the keys in the silent room. Within minutes, he had the amended page ready, the new liability clause inserted and highlighted. I read through the text once, slowly savoring the ironclad, sweeping nature of the legal language. "The transferee hereby accepts full, irrevocable, and absolute responsibility for all environmental, structural, and regulatory liabilities, both known and unknown, historical or contemporary, pertaining to the subject property and its recorded acreage." It was perfect. It was a masterpiece of binding, inescapable federal and state responsibility. I didn't rush. I took the gold pen, my hand steady, and signed my name with a flourish. The ink flowed dark and final. I slid the paper back across the obsidian surface. Bradley snatched it up, his knuckles white, as he verified my signature. He let out a long, ragged breath, a sound that was half laugh, half sob of sheer relief. "Finally," he whispered, looking at Simone. "It's done. It's actually ours." Sylvia, who had remained poised and cold throughout the entire meeting, stood up. She walked over to where I sat, her designer heels echoing against the marble floor. She looked down at me, her expression a mix of pity and absolute icy contempt. She leaned in, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You always were the weak link, Cassidy. Your father knew it and I know it. You come from a line of winners and you chose to be a disappointment. It is a relief to finally be rid of you. I felt the last vestige of the defeated persona slip away. I didn't just straighten my back. I rose from the chair with a deliberate, lethal grace. The slouch evaporated, replaced by a posture so rigid and confident that Sylvia actually stepped back, blinking in confusion. The exhaustion vanished from my face, and the desperate, watery look in my eyes hardened into a cold, brilliant steel. I reached out and adjusted my coat, smoothing the wrinkles with calm, calculated movements. I stared directly into my mother's eyes, not with the sadness of a rejected child, but with the chilling indifference of a predator who had just led her prey into a snare. "You are right, Sylvia," I said, my voice smooth, resonant, and devoid of all previous tremors. "I'm the weak link. I'm the disappointment. I'm the one who didn't fit into the family plan. I'm done playing." I looked over at Bradley, who was still staring at the signed contract, unaware that the paper he held was effectively his own death warrant. "Enjoy your cabin, Bradley. You have no idea what you've just bought." I grabbed my satchel, turned on my heel, and walked toward the door. I didn't look back at the confusion and creeping dread starting to manifest on their faces. I pushed the mahogany doors open and stepped into the hallway, leaving the vultures to feast on the toxic remains of their own arrogance. I was already dialing the EPA back as I reached the elevator. The game wasn't just over. It had only just begun, and for the first time in my life, I held every single card at the table. I stopped with my hand hovering inches from the polished brass handle of the mahogany doors. The heavy silence of the boardroom was broken only by the sound of Bradley's relieved exhales and Simone's triumphant giggling. They were already celebrating. They thought they had excised the tumor from their perfect family tree. I turned around slowly. The sharp click of my boots against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot, drawing every eye in the room back to me. "I forgot one minor detail," I said, letting the heavy doors swing shut behind me. Arthur Sterling frowned, adjusting his silk tie. "The transaction is complete, Miss Wilson. There is nothing left to discuss. I strongly advise you to exit the premises before I call building security." "Oh, I am leaving Arthur," I replied, walking right back toward the center of the room. But as a courtesy to my dear brother, I thought I should leave him with the full property profile. It is the responsible thing to do when transferring a legacy asset. I unlatched my leather satchel. The worn buckle snapped loudly. Sylvia sighed, rolling her eyes in exasperation. She crossed her arms, annoyed that her problem child was dragging out the goodbye. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, red-bordered dossier bearing the official seal of the United States government. I tossed it onto the center of the obsidian table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right next to the transfer deed Bradley was still clutching. "What is this nonsense?" Bradley snapped, refusing to let go of his newly acquired deed. "That is an official mandate from the Environmental Protection Agency," I explained, leaning over the table, bracing my weight on my hands. "I received it this morning from Director Reynolds. It contains the chemical analysis of the core samples taken directly beneath the floorboards of our father's quaint little cabin. The exact 2 acres you just fought tooth and nail to steal from me." Bradley's smug smile faltered. His eyes darted to the red-bordered folder. "Core samples. What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the 1970s, I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. 50 years ago, a wildcat mining operation used primitive cyanide and sulfuric acid extraction methods on that specific ridge. When they went bankrupt, they buried the toxic runoff. The containment barrier completely degraded decades ago. The soil beneath that cabin is saturated with lethal levels of arsenic, lead, and sulfuric acid." Arthur Sterling lunged forward, snatching the EPA mandate off the table. He ripped it open, his eyes flying across the dense paragraphs of federal legalese. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed. "Congratulations, Bradley," I said, savoring every single syllable. "You just fought tooth and nail to steal a toxic Superfund site." "That is impossible," Bradley stammered, looking from me to his lawyer. "Arthur, what does that document actually say?" "Tell me she is lying." Sterling's hands were shaking. The expensive paper rattled in his grip. "It is an official federal classification, Bradley. The EPA has condemned the 2-acre parcel. It mandates an immediate total halt to all access and operations." So what? Simone scoffed, stepping up to the table. She looked utterly unfazed. We tear the stupid cabin down. We dig up the dirt. We take the minerals underneath it. Who cares about a little toxic waste? We have $1 billion deposit. You clearly do not understand federal environmental law, Simone, I said, turning my gaze to her. The current legal owner of the deed is entirely responsible for the cleanup regardless of who originally caused the contamination. I paused, letting the silence stretch out, watching the dawning realization creep into my mother's eyes. She knew exactly what I had done. By signing that liability clause, I continued, pointing to the newly amended contract Bradley was still holding. You now personally owe the U.S. government $40 million in mandatory environmental cleanup. And because your lawyers so helpfully froze my accounts, preventing me from fighting the transfer, I am completely absolved of the debt. Bradley dropped the transfer deed as if it were coated in acid. He staggered backward, hitting the edge of a leather chair. His face went deathly pale. He snatched the papers back from Sterling, his eyes frantically scanning the liability clause he had demanded just minutes ago. 40 million, he choked out, grasping at his chest. Arthur, tell me we can reverse this. Tell me we can void the transfer. You insisted on the absolute liability clause. Sterling whispered, his professional composure completely shattered. You forced me to add it. You explicitly accepted the risk. You set us up! Sylvia shrieked, finally breaking her icy demeanor. Her face twisted into a mask of pure fury. You manipulative, vindictive little monster. You intentionally saddled your own brother with a $40 million debt. We will sue you for fraud. We will claim you withheld material information. You filed an ex parte motion claiming the property already belonged to the family trust, I reminded her coldly. You claimed I manipulated a dying man. You forced this transfer. I simply gave you exactly what you asked for. Simone was hyperventilating. She slammed her hands onto the table, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against the obsidian surface. She screamed, "What is she talking about? Where is the 800 million?" She spun around to face me, her eyes wild with panic. The rare earth element's apex energy confirmed the thermal signature. Even with a $40 million cleanup, the deposit is worth nearly $1 billion. We still win. I reached back into my satchel and pulled out a second folder. This one was a simple unmarked manila envelope. I tossed it onto the table next to the EPA mandate. I tapped the second folder twice, smiling. Oh, the rare earth vein, it is right next door. On the 500 acres I bought last month. It is 100% legally mine. The silence that followed my revelation was not merely quiet. It was a total, suffocating vacuum. The air rushed out of the room, taking all the arrogant, suffocating superiority with it. Bradley stared at the plain manila folder I had just dropped on the table, his eyes wide and unblinking. He slowly lowered his gaze back to the red boundary Environmental Protection Agency mandate. His hands began to tremble violently. The crisp, expensive parchment of the transfer deed slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. He physically collapsed into his heavy leather executive chair. The expensive mechanism groaned under his dead weight. His breath hitched, turning into shallow, rapid gasps. He was hyperventilating. The reality of the $40 million federal penalty was crashing down on him, suffocating his delusions of grandeur. He clawed at the collar of his bespoke Italian suit, suddenly desperate for air. His skin turned a sickening shade of gray, the blood completely draining from his face as his eyes darted frantically across the legal text binding him to the toxic wasteland. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped his throat. He looked like a man who had just realized he stepped on a landmine, completely paralyzed by the knowledge that any movement would trigger his absolute destruction. His corporate empire, his desperate margin calls his entire life, was now tied to an unfixable disaster. He stared blindly ahead. The trap had sprung shut on him right now. Simone stared at the documents, her perfect manicured facade shattering into a million jagged pieces. Her eyes darted from the liability clause bearing her husband's signature to the geological survey proving the rare earth minerals belonged entirely to me. The math computed in her brain with ruthless efficiency. They had not just lost an $800 million fortune, they had legally tethered themselves to a crushing, inescapable federal debt that would consume their every asset. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She turned into a wild animal. She lunged across the armrest of Bradley's chair, grabbing the lapels of his ruined suit. She began slapping his chest, hitting him with a frantic, vicious energy. Her pristine white cashmere blazer wrinkled as she physically assaulted the man she had just been conspiring with. "You idiot!" Simone screamed, her voice echoing off the frosted glass walls of the boardroom. The sound was shrill, desperate, and completely unhinged. She hit him again, her rings catching the fabric of his tie. "You arrogant, stupid idiot! You just bankrupted us for the rest of our lives." Bradley could not even defend himself from the vicious assault. He just sat there absorbing the blows, his eyes glazed over with shock, as he continued to wheeze, fully realizing his greed had sealed their grim and permanent financial doom right then and there. He looked utterly broken and completely helpless against her relentless, raging onslaught. She physically struck him twice more, very violently. Sylvia bolted upright, her chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. Her pearls clattered against her chest as she rushed forward, desperate to protect her golden child from the entirely justified wrath of his furious wife. "Simone, stop this instant," my mother commanded, using the sharp, authoritative tone she had weaponized against me for 30 years. She reached out, attempting to grab Simone's wrist and pull her away from Bradley. "Have some dignity. We will figure this out. We will hire better lawyers. We will sue Cassidy for fraud. You are making a scene." Simone whipped her head around, her eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying rage. The respect she had always feigned for the wealthy matriarch vanished instantly into thin air. Simone slapped Sylvia's hand away with brutal force. "Shut up, you old hag!" Simone shrieked, her voice venomous and raw. She pointed a trembling finger directly into my mother's shocked face. "This is your fault for raising a moron. You told me he was a genius. You told me marrying him would secure my future. You enabled his delusions, and now we are going to lose everything because he wanted to play real estate tycoon to spite his sister." Sylvia gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, her hand flying to her mouth in utter disbelief. Her pristine world was burning down right before her eyes, and she was entirely powerless to stop the absolute carnage unfolding in the room. The illusion of control evaporated completely, exposing absolute ruin. While my family tore each other apart in the center of the room, I watched Arthur Sterling. The expensive corporate litigator was not looking at the screaming women or the hyperventilating man in the chair. He was looking exclusively at the signed contract and the federal mandate. I saw the exact moment his survival instinct overrode his duty to his client. A $40 million federal debt meant frozen assets, endless litigation, and absolutely zero billable hours. Sterling slowly and methodically reached across the table. He did not retrieve the liability contract. He simply gathered his own legal pads, his gold pen, and his pristine laptop. He slid them into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut with a sharp, decisive click. The sound cut through the screaming. Bradley managed to lift his head, his eyes pleading as he watched his lawyer back away from the table. "Arthur!" Bradley gasped, reaching out a trembling hand toward the man. "Help us, please." Sterling paused at the door, adjusting his tailored cuffs with rigid precision. He looked at the chaos, then looked directly at Bradley with eyes devoid of any professional courtesy or hidden sympathy. "I am not getting paid for this," Sterling muttered, his voice cold and final. "You are on your own." He turned and walked out, letting the heavy mahogany doors swing shut behind him. I smiled, watching the magnificent absolute collapse of the people who had tried to bury me alive, finally experiencing their own permanent destruction. The silence that followed my revelation was not merely quiet, it was a total suffocating vacuum. The air rushed out of the room, taking all the arrogant, suffocating superiority with it. Bradley stared at the plain manila folder I had just dropped on the table, his eyes wide and unblinking. He slowly and deliberately lowered his gaze back to the red Boundary Environmental Protection Agency mandate. His hands began to tremble violently. The crisp, expensive parchment of the transfer deed slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floor like a dead leaf. He physically collapsed into his heavy leather executive chair. The expensive mechanism groaned under his dead weight. His breath hitched, turning into shallow, rapid gasps. He was hyperventilating. The reality of the $40 million federal penalty was crashing down on him, suffocating his delusions of grandeur. He clawed at the collar of his bespoke Italian suit, suddenly desperate for air. His skin turned a sickening shade of gray, the blood completely draining from his face as his eyes darted frantically across the legal text, binding him to the toxic wasteland. He tried to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound escaped his throat. He looked like a man who had just realized he stepped on a landmine, completely paralyzed by the knowledge that any movement would trigger his absolute destruction. His corporate empire, his desperate margin calls his entire life, was now tied to an unfixable disaster. He stared blindly ahead. The trap had sprung shut on him right now. Simone stared at the documents, her perfect manicured facade shattering into a million jagged pieces. Her eyes darted from the liability clause bearing her husband's signature to the geological survey, proving the rare earth minerals belonged entirely to me. The math computed in her brain with ruthless efficiency. They had not just lost an $800 million fortune, they had legally tethered themselves to a crushing, inescapable federal debt that would consume their every asset. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She turned into a wild animal. She lunged across the armrest of Bradley's chair, grabbing the lapels of his ruined suit. She began slapping his chest, hitting him with a frantic, vicious energy. Her pristine white cashmere blazer wrinkled as she physically assaulted the man she had just been conspiring with. "You idiot!" Simone screamed. Her voice echoing off the frosted glass walls of the boardroom, the sound was shrill, desperate, and completely unhinged. She hit him again, her rings catching the fabric of his tie. "You arrogant, stupid idiot! You just bankrupted us for the rest of our lives." Bradley could not even defend himself from the vicious assault. He just sat there absorbing the blows, his eyes glazed over with shock as he continued to wheeze, fully realizing his greed had sealed their grim and permanent financial doom right then and there. He looked utterly broken and completely helpless against her relentless, raging onslaught. She physically struck him twice more, very violently. Sylvia bolted upright, her chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. Her pearls clattered against her chest as she rushed forward, desperate to protect her golden child from the entirely justified wrath of his furious wife. "Simone, stop this instant," my mother commanded, using the sharp, authoritative tone she had weaponized against me for 30 years. She reached out, attempting to grab Simone's wrist and pull her away from Bradley. "Have some dignity. We will figure this out. We will hire better lawyers. We will sue Cassidy for fraud. You are making a scene." Simone whipped her head around, her eyes blazing with a feral, terrifying rage. The respect she had always feigned for the wealthy matriarch vanished instantly into thin air. Simone slapped Sylvia's hand away with brutal force. "Shut up, you old hag!" Simone shrieked, her voice venomous and raw. She pointed a trembling finger directly into my mother's shocked face. "This is your fault for raising a moron. You told me he was a genius. You told me marrying him would secure my future. You enabled his delusions, and now we are going to lose everything because he wanted to play real estate tycoon to spite his sister." Sylvia gasped, taking a stumbling step backward, her hand flying to her mouth in utter disbelief. Her pristine, perfect world was burning down right before her eyes, and she was entirely powerless to stop the absolute carnage unfolding in the room. The illusion of control evaporated, completely exposing absolute ruin. While my family tore each other apart in the center of the room, I watched Arthur Sterling. The expensive corporate litigator was not looking at the screaming women or the hyperventilating man in the chair. He was looking exclusively at the signed contract and the federal mandate. I saw the exact moment his survival instinct overrode his duty to his client. A $40 million federal debt meant frozen assets, endless litigation, and absolutely zero billable hours. Sterling slowly and methodically reached across the table. He did not retrieve the liability contract. He simply gathered his own legal pads, his gold pen, and his pristine laptop. He slid them into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass lock shut with a sharp, decisive click. The sound cut through the screaming. Bradley managed to lift his head, his eyes pleading as he watched his lawyer back away from the table. "Arthur!" Bradley gasped, reaching out a trembling hand toward the man. "Help us, please!" Sterling paused at the door, adjusting his tailored cuffs with rigid precision. He looked at the chaos, then looked directly at Bradley, with eyes devoid of any professional courtesy or hidden sympathy. "I am not getting paid for this," Sterling muttered, his voice cold and final. "You are on your own." He turned and walked out, letting the heavy mahogany doors swing shut behind him. I smiled, watching the magnificent absolute collapse of the people who had tried to bury me alive, finally experiencing their own permanent destruction. The heavy silence in the boardroom was broken by a sharp intake of breath from my mother. Sylvia, completely panicked, rushed around the edge of the obsidian table. Her pristine composure, carefully maintained for over 3 decades, shattered into a million jagged pieces. She dropped to her knees right in front of me, the hard marble floor scuffing her expensive designer dress. Her perfectly manicured fingers reached out, grabbing my hands with a desperate, crushing grip. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, frantic, and leaking terrified tears. "Cassidy, baby, you have to help us. He is your brother." Her voice echoed off the glass walls, shrill and utterly pathetic. "You have $800 million now. You can easily pay this fine for him. 40 million is nothing to you, Cassidy. Please do not let the federal government destroy your brother. We are family." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping woman who abused me for 30 long years. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no lingering affection, no obligation. The cold, sterile air of the boardroom mirrored the ice in my veins. I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands away from her desperate, sweaty grasp. Sylvia gasped as my fingers slipped through hers. She slumped forward, her hands hitting the floor. "A pathetic loser like me?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. I stared directly into her wet face. "Why did you not plan better, Sylvia? Those were your exact words to me, were they not, when you told me I was useless? When you told me I was a failure?" Sylvia shook her head, choking on her own sobs. "I did not mean it, Cassidy. I was just stressed. I was trying to push you to succeed. I love you so very much." "Do not insult my intelligence," I replied, stepping back to put physical distance between us. "You never loved me. You loved the control you had over me. I am not your daughter. You made that perfectly clear when you threw me out in the snow last Christmas with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. You watched me shiver, and you locked the door." Bradley moaned from his chair, clutching his chest as he struggled to breathe. He was still paralyzed by the mandate his corporate empire reduced to toxic ash by his own unyielding, arrogant, endless, immense greed. "You set him up!" Sylvia shrieked again, pounding her fists against the cold marble. "You lured him into this trap. You knew the land was poisoned." I smiled, a genuine expression of complete triumph. "I simply presented an opportunity. Bradley chose to steal it. He filed the fraudulent motions. He bribed the estate lawyers. He insisted on the absolute liability clause to ensure I could never reclaim the property. His own ruthless ambition dug this grave. I just handed him the shovel." I turned my back on my weeping mother and the hyperventilating shell of her favorite spoiled golden child. I walked toward the heavy brass doors, my leather satchel swinging at my side. The rhythmic click of my boots signaled the end of my lifelong nightmare. "Wait!" Simone screamed from behind me. Her voice was pure venom, completely stripped of its usual honeyed aristocratic tone. I paused, resting my hand on the polished handle. "I am divorcing him," Simone declared viciously, pointing a perfectly manicured nail at her wheezing husband. "I am calling my legal team right now. I am taking half of whatever is left in his accounts. He ruined my life. and I want my fair half. I did not even bother turning around to face her. I just laughed a short, sharp sound that cut through the thick misery of the room. Half of -40 million is -20 million, Simone. I said my words dripping with icy amusement. Enjoy. I pushed the heavy doors open, stepping out into the brightly lit executive corridor. The air out here felt cleaner, lighter. I left the chaos, the screaming, and the bitter sobbing behind me. The heavy doors swung shut with a definitive, satisfying thud, sealing my toxic family inside their permanent financial prison room forever now. I walked toward the elevators, every step feeling like a heavy chain breaking away from my ankles. The receptionist at the front desk stared at me with wide eyes, having clearly heard the muffled screams echoing from the boardroom. I gave her a polite nod, smoothing the lapels of my tailored blazer. I pressed the silver button for the lobby. The digital numbers above the elevator blinked as the car descended. I pulled out my phone, navigating to my banking application. The balance stared back at me in bold green numbers. $800 million. It was finally totally real. I stepped into the elevator cabin, the mirrored walls reflecting a woman who had finally reclaimed her power. For 30 years, I had accepted their scraps, internalizing their relentless abuse. They had convinced me I was destined for mediocrity, a convenient scapegoat for their own profound insecurities. But their cruelty had ultimately been their undoing. Their blind greed had blinded them to the trap. I watched the floors tick down, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over my soul. I was entirely free. The toxic wasteland belonged to Bradley. The wealth, the future, and the freedom were fully mine. The elevator chimed a soft, cheerful note as it reached the ground floor. The doors slid open to reveal the bustling, sunlit lobby of the corporate center. I walked past the security turnstiles, my head held high. Outside, the crisp city air hit my face, refreshing and full of endless possibilities. I hailed a passing taxi, slipping into the comfortable leather back seat. "Where to, miss?" the driver asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. I smiled, looking out the window at the vibrant, moving city. "The airport," I replied smoothly. "I have a brilliant life to start living today." The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind Arthur Sterling, sealing my family inside the tomb of their own making. The sound echoed through the sprawling, glass-walled boardroom, carrying with it the absolute finality of their destruction. Sterling was their last line of defense, their high-priced shield against the consequences of their relentless greed. With his departure, the remaining oxygen in the room seemed to completely evaporate. Bradley remained slumped in his executive chair, a hollow, hyperventilating shell of a man paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his $40 million toxic debt. He stared blankly at the polished obsidian table, his chest heaving with shallow, frantic gasps. Simone stood over him, her chest heaving, her manicured hands curled into fists, looking as though she wanted to inflict even more physical violence upon the man who had just permanently obliterated her lavish lifestyle. Sylvia stood frozen near the head of the table. Her pristine, perfectly curated world was burning to ash right before her eyes. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The money was gone. The legacy was gone. The unassailable corporate empire her husband had built, the one she had ruthlessly protected by discarding me, was now anchored to an inescapable federal nightmare. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for a loophole, a scapegoat, a savior. They landed on me. I stood perfectly still, my leather satchel resting comfortably against my hip, watching all the glorious devastation unfold. For 33 years, Sylvia had looked at me with nothing but cold, calculating disgust. I was the flawed product of her perfection, the daughter who refused to conform to her shallow materialistic demands. But now, as she stared at me across the ruins of her golden child's future, the disgust in her eyes morphed into something entirely different. It was pure, unadulterated panic. Sylvia stumbled forward, her designer heels clicking erratically against the cold marble floor. Her immaculate composure, maintained with terrifying precision for decades, shattered completely. She practically threw herself across the room, closing the distance between us in a frantic blur of motion. Before I could even step back, she dropped to her knees right in front of me. The sharp impact of her bones hitting the hard floor made a sickening thud, but she did not seem to register the pain. Her hands, heavy with diamond rings bought with trust fund money, shot out and grabbed my wrists. Her grip was desperate and crushing, her fingers digging into my skin like a drowning woman clinging to a lifeline. She looked up at me, her perfectly applied makeup streaked with terrified, ugly tears. Her chest heaved as she choked on her own desperate sobs, abandoning every ounce of dignity she possessed. "Cassidy, baby, you have to help us!" Sylvia wailed, her voice shrill and entirely pathetic, echoing off the frosted glass walls. "He is your brother. You cannot let this happen. You have $800 million now. You can pay this fine for him. 40 million is nothing to you, Cassidy. Please do not let the federal government destroy your brother. We are family." I looked down at the weeping, pathetic woman groveling at my feet. I searched my heart for a flicker of sympathy, for a tiny ember of familial duty. There was absolutely nothing. The well had run completely dry. The cold, sterile air of the boardroom perfectly matched the absolute ice flowing through my veins. I did not feel pity. I did not feel triumph. I simply felt empty and wonderfully free. I slowly and deliberately pulled my hands away from her desperate, sweaty grasp. She gasped as my fingers slipped through hers, slumping forward, as if I had physically struck her. "A pathetic loser like me?" I asked, my voice deadly calm and devoid of any emotion. I stared directly into her wet, frantic eyes, forcing her to hear every single syllable. "Why did you not plan better, Sylvia?" Those were your exact words to me, were they not, when you told me I was useless, when you told me I was a failure, when you told me I would never amount to anything. Sylvia shook her head wildly, choking on her tears. "I did not mean it, Cassidy. I was just stressed. I was trying to push you to succeed. I love you. I have always loved you." "Do not insult my intelligence," I replied, stepping back to put physical distance between us. "You never loved me. You loved the control you had over me. I am not your daughter. You made that perfectly clear when you threw me out in the snow last Christmas with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. You watched me shiver on the porch and you locked the door." Bradley moaned loudly from his chair, a pathetic wheezing sound that cut through his mother's sobbing. He was entirely broken, crushed under the heavy weight of his own profound arrogance. I turned my back on them both, walking toward the heavy brass doors. Simone screamed from behind me. "I am divorcing him," she declared viciously, pointing a perfectly manicured nail at her wheezing husband. "I am calling my legal team right now. I am taking half of whatever is left. He ruined my life." I laughed without looking back. "Half of -40 million is -20 million, Simone. Enjoy." I pushed the heavy, polished mahogany doors open and stepped out into the brightly lit executive corridor. The crisp, cool, perfectly conditioned air hit my face, refreshing and full of endless, brilliant possibilities. I gladly left the screaming, the sobbing, and the absolute chaos behind me. The heavy doors swung shut with a definitive, satisfying thud, sealing my toxic family inside their permanent financial prison forever. I walked down the long, quiet hall, feeling lighter than I ever had before. I pressed the silver button for the private elevator, ready to go meet the tech billionaires and finally claim my throne. The flight to Seattle gave me 6 hours to review the geological surveys and background profiles on the men I would face. When my car pulled up to the towering monolith of Apex Energy headquarters, I felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. This was not the freezing Alaskan cabin where they first tried to intimidate me, thinking I was a naive landowner easily bullied into surrendering my inheritance for pennies. Today, the power dynamic was entirely inverted. I strode through the expansive lobby, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. The receptionist jumped out of her chair to scan my badge and escort me to the top-floor executive suite. The doors opened to reveal a massive, sunlit conference room overlooking the Puget Sound. Marcus Vance, the chief executive officer of Apex Energy, stood at the sleek glass table flanked by two senior vice presidents. 6 months ago, Vance had worn a smug sneer threatening eminent domain and protracted legal battles. Today, his expensive suit looked a size too tight. A faint sheen of perspiration glistened on his forehead, his forced smile rigid. He extended a hand as I approached. I ignored him, taking the seat opposite him and placing my satchel on the glass. "Cassidy," Vance said, withdrawing his hand and clearing his throat. "Let us get straight to business. We have reviewed the geological data for the 500 acres you acquired. The thermal signature confirms a massive deposit of rare earth elements. It confirms the largest untouched deposit in North America, Marcus," I corrected. "A deposit you require to fulfill the Department of Defense contract. Your firm just won a contract secured by assuring the Pentagon you had an active domestic supply chain ready for immediate extraction." Vance shifted uncomfortably. His vice presidents exchanged nervous glances, painfully aware of their precarious position. Failing to deliver on a federal defense contract meant catastrophic financial penalties and the collapse of Apex Energy. "We are prepared to make a generous offer to acquire the parcel outright," Vance stated, trying to regain a sliver of authority. He slid an embossed folder across the table. $100 million, cash. The transfer can be completed by the end of the week. You walk away a wealthy woman completely free of the logistical nightmare of a mining operation. I ignored the folder, keeping my gaze locked firmly on Vance. $100 million is an insult. That deposit is valued at nearly $1 billion once processed. Extraction is complex and highly regulated, the vice president on the left interjected defensively. You lack the infrastructure or capital to pull those minerals out of the ground. We do. $100 million is a premium buyout. I unlatched my satchel and pulled out my own documents, spreading them across the table. They contain detailed topographical maps, chemical runoff models, and federal compliance codes. "You clearly have not updated your risk assessment matrix," I said, tapping the center map. "This is my 500 acres. Right next to it, sharing the exact subterranean water table, is a 2-acre parcel currently owned by my brother Bradley. That parcel is officially designated by the Environmental Protection Agency as a toxic Superfund site saturated with lethal levels of arsenic and sulfuric acid from a failed mining operation." Vance frowned, inspecting the documents. "What does that have to do with your land?" "Everything," I replied smoothly. "The rare earth vein runs dangerously close to that toxic boundary. Standard extraction methods, the kind Apex Energy relies on, involve heavy explosive fracturing and chemical leaching. If you attempt your standard operations on my land, the seismic vibrations will inevitably fracture the degraded containment barrier on Bradley's property. The toxic runoff will flood the underground aquifer, instantly contaminating the entire rare earth deposit and triggering a catastrophic federal environmental disaster." The color drained from Vance's face. The vice president stared at the topographical maps as if viewing a death warrant. "I am the only person who holds the specific proprietary extraction patents designed for highly sensitive zero-vibration mining." I continued, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "I spent the last 3 years quietly acquiring those patents. I am the only person who can legally and safely extract those minerals without triggering a federal shutdown. Your infrastructure is entirely useless without my intellectual property and my land." Vance swallowed hard, loosening his tie. His breathing became shallow. He was trapped, and he knew it. "What do you want, Cassidy?" "I am not selling my land," I stated. "I am forcing a mandatory joint venture. I will grant Apex Energy exclusive access to my zero-vibration extraction patents and the mining rights to the 500 acres. In exchange, my parcel and intellectual property will be valued at $800 million, fully integrated into the corporate valuation of this joint venture." $800 million! Vance choked out, his eyes widening in panic. "That is an unprecedented equity demand. That would effectively restructure our entire corporate hierarchy." "Exactly," I smiled, sliding the final contract across the table. "The joint venture makes me the majority shareholder of the extraction project." Furthermore, I require an immediate permanent seat on the Apex Energy Board of Directors, with full voting rights on all future acquisitions and federal defense contracts. You work for me now. The room descended into heavy silence. The executives stared at the contract. They had no leverage, no alternate supply chain, and no time. If they refused, they lost the Pentagon contract and faced immediate corporate bankruptcy. If they signed, they handed the keys to their empire directly to the woman they had once tried to destroy. Vance looked at his vice presidents, finding only silent, terrified agreement. His hands shook as he reached into his breast pocket and retrieved his gold pen. He uncapped it slowly, shoulders slumped in total defeat. Without a word of protest, Marcus Vance leaned forward and signed the contract, legally cementing my position as the most powerful woman in the industry. The transition from the stifling Apex Energy boardroom to the crisp air of my new reality was swift and absolute. 6 months had passed since Marcus Vance signed his company over to me. 6 months since Bradley's spectacular federally mandated ruin became front-page news. I did not waste a single moment looking back at the ashes of my former family. Instead, I built my own empire. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the floor-to-ceiling glass of my new residence, a sprawling, ultra-modern eco-mansion perched high above the Seattle skyline. The marvel was a testament to everything I had achieved. It was powered entirely by renewable energy integrated seamlessly into the lush Pacific Northwest hillside and purchased with a fraction of the cash advance from my joint venture. I stood on the expansive cedar deck, the cool breeze carrying the scent of pine and salt water, feeling an absolute unshakable peace. There was no lingering trauma, no residual guilt, and no anxiety about the future. I had excised the toxic elements from my life with surgical precision, leaving only pure, unadulterated victory in their wake. The deck was currently transformed into a highly orchestrated media venue. Dozens of reporters, photographers, and industry analysts buzzed around the perimeter, their cameras focused on the sleek wooden podium set up near the infinity pool. The financial world was desperate to understand the woman who appeared from nowhere, to strong-arm a titan like Apex Energy into surrendering its majority stake. I watched them from the upper balcony sipping coffee, completely untouched by the frenzy below. My legal team, a formidable group of top-tier corporate sharks, I had personally handpicked to replace any sycophants like Arthur Sterling, managed the crowd with ruthless efficiency. I was no longer the discarded daughter begging for validation. I was a voting board member of a multinational energy conglomerate holding $800 million in assets and possessing the exclusive patents to the safest extraction technology on the continent. I was powerful, respected, and entirely untouchable. When the clock struck 10, I descended the floating glass staircase. The chatter instantly died down, replaced by the rapid clicking of camera shutters. I stepped up to the podium, placing my hands flat on the smooth wood. I did not need notes. I knew exactly what I was building and why. I looked out over the sea of journalists, my posture radiating the kind of absolute certainty that only comes from surviving the absolute worst and emerging completely victorious. I smiled a sharp, composed expression that commanded immediate attention. "Good morning?" I began, my voice clear and carrying effortlessly over the quiet crowd. Over the past year, I have secured a unique position within the global resource extraction sector. My joint venture with Apex Energy has proven that profitability and environmental stewardship are not mutually exclusive concepts. We are revolutionizing the industry, prioritizing sustainable methods, and setting a new standard for corporate responsibility. However, my vision extends far beyond a single company profit margin. Today, I am proud to announce the next phase of my professional commitment. The reporters leaned in, pens hovering over notepads, digital recorders thrust forward. I paused, letting the anticipation build, savoring the absolute control I held over the narrative. I am officially launching the Northern Vanguard Foundation. I declared, the name ringing with strength and purpose. I am seeding this initiative with an initial personal endowment of $50 million. The explicit mission of this foundation is the aggressive, uncompromising protection of public and private lands against predatory corporate practices. We will provide top-tier legal representation, independent geological surveys, and robust financial support to individuals and communities facing corporate bullying, eminent domain threats, or illegal toxic dumping. No entity, regardless of its size, wealth, or historical influence, will be permitted to exploit vulnerable landowners or destroy the environment for short-term financial gain. We will actively hunt down fraudulent operations, expose toxic liabilities, and ensure that those who attempt to poison the land are held permanently and financially accountable. A ripple of excited murmurs swept through the press pool. They recognized the aggressive stance, the thinly veiled warning to the old guard. The foundation was my ultimate safeguard, an institutional weapon designed to ensure that no one would ever be subjected to the kind of manipulative, greedy tactics my family had attempted to use against me. I was taking the very strategies that nearly destroyed me and turning them into a fortress for others. I opened the floor to questions, answering with crisp authority. I outlined our legal strategies, our partnership with federal environmental agencies, and our commitment to total transparency. Every answer reinforced my position at the absolute apex of the industry. As the press conference neared its conclusion, a seasoned reporter from a major financial network raised her hand. She adjusted her glasses, looking at me with a mixture of intense professional curiosity and genuine awe. "Ms. Williams," the reporter asked, her voice projecting clearly over the remaining murmurs, "your ascent in the corporate and environmental sectors has been unprecedented. You have fundamentally restructured a major energy corporation, pioneered revolutionary extraction patents, and now launched a massive philanthropic foundation. Looking back at this incredible journey, what drove you to achieve such an empire?" The deck fell completely silent. The cameras focused tightly on my face, waiting for a profound statement on business acumen or environmental philosophy. I looked directly into the primary camera lens, my posture relaxed, my victory absolute. A slow smile spread across my face. I thought of Bradley suffocating under his $40 million fine. I thought of Sylvia trapped in her own ruined legacy. I thought of the cold structure they tried to banish me to. I was gifted a rundown cabin in Alaska, I said, my voice steady, precise, and utterly triumphant. It taught me that sometimes you just have to dig a little deeper to clear out the trash.